Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Xerxes Spencer, Director of Fellowship Programs here at the National Endowment for Democracy. On behalf of NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies, I'm pleased to welcome everyone to today's presentation, Creating a Resilient and Inclusive Democracy in India, featuring Reagan-Fussell Democracy Fellow Elsa Marie D'Silva. We're delighted to have with us as discussant today Ambassador Melanne Verveer, Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. As many of you may know, the Reagan-Fussell Democracy Fellows Program is an international exchange program funded by the U.S. Congress, through which some of the world's most dedicated democracy activists, journalists, and scholars pursue independent projects here at the NED. We are now in our 18th year and have hosted over time over 300 fellows from 90 countries since our founding in 2001. Within this remarkable group, our speaker today stands out for her extraordinary commitment to putting, as she puts it, gender on the democracy agenda in India and around the world. Elsa is the founder and chief executive officer of the Red Dot Foundation, based in Mumbai, which works to end violence against women. She's also the innovator of Safecity, an online platform that uses crowdsourcing to track reports of sexual violence and harassment in public spaces and maps this data to show unsafe areas in cities. Since launching Safecity in 2012, Elsa has overseen the platform's rise to become the largest crowdsourcing app on the issue, not only in India, but also in Kenya, Cameroon, and Nepal. For her pioneering work, and she really is a pioneer, she has received Vital Voices Global Leadership Award in 2017, the Government of India's Women Transforming India Award in 2016, and the Digital Women in Social Impact Award in 2013. In her remarks, Elsa will show how the prevalence of violence against women in India hinders their full participation in the public sphere. Sexual violence skews birth ratios, limits access to education and health, and discourages women from participating in the labor force and politics. Elsa will show how the kind of storytelling that Safecity facilitates can help to give women a voice, build solidarity, mobilize grassroots action, and create a more inclusive democracy. Ambassador Melanne Verveer is Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, and also Special Representative on Gender Issues for the OSCE Chairmanship. She previously served as the first U.S. Ambassador for Global Women's Issues, a position to which she was nominated by President Obama in 2009. From 2000 to 2008, she was the chair and co-CEO of Vital Voices, which she co-founded to invest in emerging women leaders. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Secretary of State's Award for Distinguished Service. For our part in the Fellows Program, we are especially proud to call Melanne one of our own, as she sits on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy and also on the Fellowships Committee of the board as well. Before I begin, I would like to recognize three departing staff members, Andrea Blazanovic, Jenny Barker, and Emily Myers, all of whom have been instrumental in the planning and execution not only of today's event, but many other past Fellows events. We are enormously grateful to you, Emily, Andrea, and Jenny, for your vital contributions to our work, and wish you all the very best as you head to graduate school this fall. The format of today's presentation will be as follows. We'll start with a brief video that Elsa will show. She'll then speak for about 25 minutes, followed by Melanne, who'll speak for about 5 to 10. We'll then have time for Q&A. For those of you on Twitter, you can follow this conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents or by following the forum at Think Democracy and the Endowment at NE Democracy. Finally, let me take a moment to ask you to please silence your cell phones if you have not already done so. Thank you.
I never told anyone about that day. I was 13 years old. I was shocked. I didn't know what was happening to me, but I felt it. A man on the train, a complete stranger, touched me in a way that I knew was wrong. And I didn't say a thing about it. In fact, this happens every day in every city in India and around the world. Indian women tend to stay silent. In December 2012, something happened that shook the country. A 23-year-old woman and her friend boarded a private bus. On that bus, there were 6 other men who, during that journey, beat her male friend up and then gang raped her. They inserted metal rods into her body, pulled out her intestines, and dumped her on the side of the road. She ultimately died of her injuries. It took something like this, which was so brutal in nature, to force the conversation of sexual violence in the public domain. So many people wanted change. I wanted to do something too, and that's why I started Safecity. To me, the biggest problem was that women were not sharing their experiences of sexual violence for fear of bringing shame to themselves and their families. So Safecity was created as a safe space where women and girls could share their stories anonymously. These stories are then collated as location-based trends, which we could then visualize on a map as hotspots and put out into the public domain. Women could use the same information to make better choices for their own safety. This is a new data set that the police don't have. We presented it to them and they changed their beat patrol timings. And that actually dropped the crime rate. Ultimately, sexual violence is a societal issue. And we need men and boys to be part of the solution. The more stories we get, the more change we can make. Helping to make every city a safe city. Thank you everyone for coming. I truly appreciate it. So you probably are wondering, what has sexual violence got to do with democracy? Well, I, as you know, come from India. I live in Mumbai when I'm not traveling. And India is the world's largest democracy. Just a couple of months ago, we went through our elections, national elections, where almost 1 billion people voted a new government in a fairly safe manner. And today, I'm going to try and make that connection. What exactly does a democracy mean? Who is part of it or excluded? How are we engaged in it or not? And how patriarchal structures create a situation where there is a power struggle and causes crimes with impunity. So I started on this journey, as you could see from the video, about 7 years ago when Jyoti Singh was gang raped on that bus in Delhi. When that incident took place, it shocked a lot of people in my country. I was shocked too. It made national news and international news. And it was a moment in time where one had to pause and reflect. At the time, I was working in the aviation industry, where I had a long career of close to 20 years. I was vice president network planning where my portfolio included the scheduling, management, and optimization of almost 500 daily flights. And it was also a moment in time, where I was wondering what next for me, because whilst my work was exciting, I was really looking for my purpose. And I'd reached a point where I felt I wanted to give back. I wanted to give back on women's rights, work on the topic of women's rights, but I didn't know what exactly to focus on, because as you know, women's rights, there's so many things to work on. And when the situation with Jyoti Singh happened, I found my calling. So what I did was, I started Safecity with friends of mine. And the reason why I started it was because I felt that there was a data gap that exists. In my corporate career, I was constantly referring to data, historical data, to understand patterns and trends to make current and future business decisions. And as I was trying to make sense of Jyoti Singh's incident and trying to understand what was the situation in India, I could only come across this one statistic, which is often quoted and even quoted up to today. This statistic is by UN Women, which says that globally, on an average, 1 in 3 women, that's 1 in 3 women, experience at least one form of sexual assault in their lifetime. But when I was listening to the stories around me during Jyoti Singh's gang rape and after that, my sample size seemed like it was 100%. And yet, 80% of us choose not to talk about it. I say us because I started to remember all my own experiences of being assaulted on the train, for example, and several other cases where I'd witnessed masturbation in public spaces, being harassed at the workplace, etc., but which I had filed to the back of my mind and completely forgotten. So if you don't have this data, there really exists a cycle of violence and a silence around this issue. So today, I'd like to, draw your attention to what sexual violence means in a democracy, how does it impact women's participation in life, and how does it really affect their quality of life. It doesn't always seem obvious, so therefore, please bear with me. I'll try to make this linkage as we move through the slides. So I came across this quote from the last speech of Hubert Humphrey, where he says that the moral test of a government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped. Women in my country constitute almost 50% of the population, yet they are treated as a political minority, where they do not have formal equality, terms that I picked up in the last few months in DC. In short, whilst on paper, we as women should have equality, we are not allowed to practically live it. In India, our constitution guarantees us equality. And we have several laws and legislations on the books. That's not the problem. It's the implementation and execution of it that is weak. So for example, our constitution guarantees us the right to equality, the right to life, the right to live with dignity, the right to practice any occupation, and the right to a safe environment. We're also signatories to various international conventions, like the International Labour Organization that protects your rights at work, but also the Convention to End All Discrimination Against Women. So through these, I want to really bring about, throw a light on how India's performing when it comes to the treatment of women. So I picked up the SDGs because currently most of the governments around the world, including my government, is trying to achieve the various sustainable development goals by 2030. And if you think about the sustainable development goals, we have one that is dedicated to gender equality, which is number 5, which tries to get governments to ensure that all forms of discrimination and violence against women is ended. There's recognition for unpaid work. They improve the effective participation in political and economic life for women, provide equal opportunities, equal access to healthcare, economic resources, information and technology, and ensure effective gender policies and laws. So I'm going to take the Niti Aayog's reporting on gender equality to the UN. This is from their site, and this table points out how we are performing across the 17 SDGs, across all the states. And I just want you to focus on two columns, which is SDG 5, which is gender equality, and 17, which is sustainable cities and communities. And we are mapping our work against those as well. And if you see those two columns, they are pretty much in the red. So if you look at the map of India, this is our reporting on SDG 5. When I say our reporting, our government's reporting, everything is below average. Red means we are performing below average. And those two tiny slivers are the states of Kerala and Sikkim. And there are two dots which you can't see, which are the union territories of Daman and Diu and Andaman and Nicobar Islands. That is performing on an average. This is worrisome. So if you take any development index, or you take any kind of indicator, the performance of India is really atrocious. So these are some of the statistics that I'd like to point out. So for example, what is our participation in political life? So in our state legislative assembly, we have less than 9% women leaders. And in the current national election, we moved from 12% to 14%, which everybody is celebrating. And we are very happy about it and proud about it. But we are really struggling to actually formalize the gender quota of 33%. And it's not that we can't do it. We can do it. Because we've shown that at the grassroots level, that panchayat level, we have met that quota and more. And it's not about, that women are not capable. They are perfectly capable. They just need a platform to thrive and lead. Because at the panchayat level, you have so many examples of some amazing women leaders who have done lots of amazing things at the grassroots level. Take, for example, how it affects the birth rate. So sexual violence, it's a manifestation of how you really see women in society. And in India, there is a preference for the male child. How does it translate into? If you look at what we are reporting, 898 female births for every 1,000 male births. But the latest statistics actually show that it's 806 female births for every 1,000 male births in two of the states, Andhra Pradesh and Rajasthan. And what it really practically translates into is 37 million extra men. And that is a problem. 37 million extra men. Those are populations of entire countries. If you take our economic participation, over the decades, we've been sliding. So some few decades ago, we were at 42%, and currently, according to Deloitte, we're at 26%. Of course, we are reporting 32%. But it's only decreasing in a country where currently we have the maximum number of graduates, yet they're not translating into jobs in the labor force. And one of the reasons why what holds women back is the perception of safety. Take other statistics. We have access to education and healthcare that are still issues. And for me, it's a policy and governance issue, because if you create policies like the current maternity benefit policy, which provides 6 months leave to women, and you don't address the core problem, which is how do we really see women in society and treat them, you're not going to see any benefits of this policy. This policy is actually translating into exclusion of women from the workforce, because now companies do not really want to hire them. They don't want to really give them 6 months leave. And right at the bottom, I want to talk about that particular statistic, which is for every 1 million of the population, you have 13 courts. Think about that. For 1 million of the population, you have 13 courts. Why is that important? It's important because when you talk about sexual violence and you're asking for justice, can you imagine how long it's going to take you? And what you have to deal with it to actually seek justice for your case? So these things are really important, and I want you to keep this in mind as I talk about more about my work and why it's important. These are just some of the development indexes. You know, we have the Georgetown Institute, their index on the women, peace, and security front, where we are at 131 out of 153 countries. You take the World Economic Forum, their gender gap index lists India at 108 out of 144 countries. The Thomson Reuters Perception Survey lists us as the #1 most dangerous country in the world, ahead of Syria, Saudi Arabia, and even the Congo. Can you imagine that? And you know, the UNDP lists us at 130 out of 189. I don't like seeing these statistics, and it horrifies me. You know, but we cannot move up this list if we don't address how we treat our women, and in particular, the sexual violence and other forms of violence against women. And why is it important in a democracy? Because a democracy should work for all. It should include all. And in a weak and floundering democracy, what happens is that violence against women spikes and increases. And if we are currently here, can you imagine if there's any threat to our democracy, it's only going to push us down at the bottom of all these lists. So, my hero, Hillary Clinton, rightly said that women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. And as I started on this journey about 7 years ago, I realized that there is a major problem. The problem is that there is a culture which allows these crimes to take place with impunity. There is an accountability issue. And the first step in addressing this is to first call it out. So we spend a lot of time helping people understand the spectrum of sexual violence. Often we think of sexual violence as rape and assault, which is at one end of the spectrum. And on a daily basis, we tend to ignore the verbal and non-verbal forms of it, whether it is staring, ogling, touching, groping, masturbation in public spaces, indecent exposure, showing pornography, and others. And we may think it's trivial, and we've normalized it over a period of time, but in effect, it can be extremely debilitating to many, limiting our choices, limiting our movement, and thereby our opportunities and access to a quality of life, and also it impacts our mental health. And if you think about it, it starts off by first objectifying a woman and then degrading her and then assaulting her person. And whilst I work specifically on the topic of sexual violence, I can assure you that it actually leads to other forms of violence which I am not dealing with, which is domestic violence, sex slavery, human trafficking, and so much more. And what it does is it creates a culture, a cycle of insecure cultures, where first there is under-communication. So it creates and encourages a silence around the issue, and this results in under-reporting, which means that official statistics do not reflect the nature and the size of the problem. Authorities like the police are not compelled to act. There is no accountability. Bystanders do not intervene. And the perpetrators get bolder over a period of time. This just further increases the under-respect that we have for women in society, which results in far greater harm, as I have already pointed out with the other statistics. So my solution, Safecity, encourages women and others to report their stories anonymously. These are then plotted on a map as location-based trends. And the idea is to have it in the public domain so that we can look at it from a location perspective. What is happening where, and why is it the comfort zone of the perpetrator? And what can we do about it? We can zoom in right up to the street level and try and understand how it's impacting our neighborhood, and also gives us the ability to engage with it. So if you think of a democracy, access to information is key. Engagement of citizens on a daily basis is key. Accountability of stakeholders is key. In my country, unlike this country, we don't have open data. So if you wanted crime data, you would have to make what is known as a right to information application at every single police station, which is impossible. This is one of the stories which we collected. This woman was traveling by train in Mumbai, and Mumbai is considered safer compared to Delhi. She took the train at 10 p.m. in the night, and when she got off, she got into a tuk-tuk, an auto, and the driver just drove past her house, and he wouldn't stop. And she started screaming and yelling, and finally, he managed to stop, and she jumped out of it. And it made her really afraid. Take another story. This woman was traveling by train again in Mumbai with her 14-year-old sister, and she was catcalled. And when she did have the courage to speak up, the people around her did not support her. In fact, they blamed her for being at the wrong place at the wrong time. And that made her really upset, but also disappointed. So these stories are not unique stories. These stories resonate with a lot of women, not only in my country, but also in other countries. And reading other stories allows women to, first of all, understand what constitutes sexual violence, because often we are made to believe that this is okay. Know that they are not alone, because the silence culture really makes you feel very alone, that it's only happening to you and that you're the cause of it. And you feel empowered to break the silence, which to me is really the first step in seeking help. So how have we used this data? In many different ways. So as individuals, we need information to keep ourselves safe, to make better choices for our own safety. If you think about your daily routine, you use several different apps on a daily basis, like TripAdvisor, Yelp, to depend on peer reviews and make decisions. But when it comes to safety, we hardly talk about it. But I'm sure if we shared our own stories, we could learn from each other and maybe be better prepared. Secondly, we can engage communities. I have found that this data has been very useful to engage communities, especially men, to understand the problem, but also help find solutions. And often, we expect our communities to have our back, but that's not really happening. So most of the time, we feel that the men are not perpetrators of violence, but they are definitely bystanders that stay silent, and that needs to change. And what about institutions like the police, who don't get the data in their official statistics? We still depend on them for security, and we need them to act. And we have found that they go to our website directly, or they accept dashboards from us, which help them in their decision-making, whether it is to change their beat patrol or increase vigilance. But there are many other institutional service providers, like municipal corporations, educational authorities, transportation authorities, etc., who can have better systems to respond and address and prevent this kind of atrocities against women. This is one of the examples from our Delhi campaign, where toilets seem to be a big issue. And this is a wall mural in the toilet complex where the women and girls put their feelings on the wall. And these talking walls, we call them talking walls, help challenge this patriarchal culture. So you're not directly challenging a male authority, but through the wall you're expressing what they are doing and calling that behavior out. And we have found that it actually helps. It helps put the community on notice, and it reduces, if not eliminates, that kind of behavior, whether it's staring, loitering, or commenting. We work a lot with youth. So far, we worked with over 500 youth across various college campuses, 50% of whom are young men. And that's another important piece, right? Education in schools and colleges, right from a young age, talking about consent, about respect, about other issues like sexual violence. We tend to protect our children, but often they are the first ones to be abused. And in fact, if we equip them with the right knowledge and strategies to address it, we would have a stronger thinking population. And we have found that when you engage young men, they really want to be agents of change. It's just that they've never been given a platform to do so. Another example is involving the community. In a democracy, giving the power back to the community to shape their own solutions is key. And here, this is a sabha, which is a meeting. It's in Delhi, but this is similar to what we have in various other places, including rural India. Most of these women are illiterate, and they invited the police, the local police, to demand better security conditions. And the police said, oh, we don't have a single statistic in our police station. And they were able to give him 200 of these crowdsourced anonymous reports, and the police had to make a public retraction of their statement and promise to increase vigilance and security. And the next slide is basically the follow-up meeting where the police invited the youth into the police station, gave them a cup of tea, and explained the process of how do you file a complaint and what happens next. This is important because in many places, the police is seen as an entity not to be trusted, an entity to be feared. And if we can break down these barriers and build trust relationships, we will have a more vibrant and inclusive democracy. So what have we achieved? Over 12,000 stories, not only from India, but from different parts of the world. Most of these stories have come in through extensive on-ground workshops, explaining to people their rights and the spectrum of abuse. We've engaged over 500,000 citizens through this data. Our app is a global app. It consists of a web app, mobile app on Android and iOS in several languages. We also have what is known as a missed call facility. That means you call a number, it gets disconnected, and we call you back and get your story. We accept paper forms in places where they don't have internet and mobile access. Somebody can take it down if they are illiterate. So technology should not be a barrier to reporting. We just want people to document their story, because if they didn't document it, it did not happen. We have partners, several of them through our Vital Voices networks in different countries, mainly Kenya, Cameroon, Nepal, Malaysia, and so on and so forth. And we officially send the dashboards to 3 police forces, but several of them have informed us that they go directly to our website to take the data. So our approach is a very low-cost, low-tech solution. We use existing technology to spread the word, to create safe spaces for conversations, because the more you talk about sexual violence and remove the the taboo around it, it'll be easier for people to come forward and share their experiences. And we have an online, offline model. I don't think this is possible if you just put a piece of technology out there and leave it to the universe to send the stories in. You have to invest. So, I've been saying it takes intention and investment to really solve this problem. It takes intention and investment from the top down, but also mobilizing the community at the grassroots level to find the accountability. Some of the ways we've used the data is in schools and colleges in India for safe college campuses and safe schools, strengthening their redressal mechanisms, but also prevention policies. Elected representatives in several places have made budgets available for local solutions. And their favorite seems to be CCTV cameras, but at least it's a start. Police have changed beat patrol timings and increased vigilance. And to me, I feel that is the most positive thing, because often, you feel police will not engage with you, but I have only had good responses from them. And of course, in many countries, my partners are collecting the data to make a case for legislation. Let's not forget, in India, we have lots of laws, but in many countries, there are no laws on this topic. So we need to push for legislation, which is the minimum standard. And lastly, I'd like to, invite you to reflect on what we've shared today and how it links up to democracy. Because yes, we are excited that India is the largest democracy, and it's a beautiful country. I would love for all of you to visit it. I love my country a lot. But it concerns me that we are at the bottom of several of these lists. And if today I stand before you, it's because I am privileged. There are so many women who do not have the opportunities that I do. So if you are someone who's experienced sexual violence, please know you're not alone, it's not your fault, and you have every right to report and seek help. And I see there are many India lovers in the room, and you work with India, in India. I would encourage you to take a governance approach and a risk management approach to really push the agenda where your partners on the ground have strong systems to prevent sexual violence and also redressal mechanisms to solve it. And it has to come from a gender perspective. It cannot be, sorted out in silos, cannot be dealt with in silos. It has to have a gender perspective because all of this is interlinked. And so I would encourage you to think about those connections and join me in this fight, because the time for being polite is over. We need to step up the efforts to solve this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Elsa, for that incredibly inspiring presentation. As heartbreaking as it is to hear and rehear that horrific story of gang rape that took place in 2012, that proved to be the tipping point for you, it's incredibly heartening and inspiring to see how you have transformed that horrific tragedy into a call for action and galvanized populations across the country and beyond the borders of India. So I applaud you for what you are doing, and we look forward to a discussion with you. Let us turn to Melanne, who will share her own perspectives on the presentation. Melanne.
Thank you, Xerxes, and good morning, everybody. And truly special thanks to Elsa for her leadership and her commitment. We should never underestimate the difference that one person can make. And I think the work that she's been doing for the last many years demonstrates that in spades. So thank you, Elsa. The work that she has taken on is work that all of us need to be engaged in. And it is important not only that she can go forward and grow it, but that we can create the kind of constituency around the world to truly once and for all make a larger difference on this issue. I think it's appropriate that we are discussing this issue here at the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, because often when we talk about violence against women and all of its manifestations, we rarely talk about the connection to democracy. And I think that's a very important component of this discussion today. But to create resilient and inclusive democracies where there is pervasive violence against women, half the populations are impacted, is really difficult to ensure those resilient and inclusive democracies. I've often wondered, and I've truly been frustrated, that this is one of those issues that is so marginalized in public policy, not taken anywhere near as seriously as it must be taken. It is indeed a global scourge. It is not confined to India. It is a problem all over the world with very serious consequences for all of society, not just the women who have been abused. And it is manifested in many ways. You saw some of those ways on the screen. It's also manifested in issues like domestic violence, intimate partner violence, in honor killings, in human trafficking, in femicide, in child marriage, in harassment, and so many ways, including rape as a tool of war, a strategic tool. So this is pervasive in so many different ways and needs to be addressed accordingly. Fundamentally, it is a violation of human rights, and it flies in the face of gender equality. It snuffs out the potential of women to be fully participatory in their societies. And democracy without the participation of women is a contradiction in terms. You cannot have both. And Elsa has showed us the consequences of this issue as it plays out in the largest democracy in the world, which is India. In addition to the toll on women, this violence poses serious consequences for the economy. We now have extensive data that correlates violence against women to the lack of productivity, because women can't work, they can't keep their minds on work. It takes a toll on economics and economic viabilities of societies. It has enormous healthcare consequences. And the democracies are not only shortchanged by the loss of women's participation, but we must keep in mind that governments have a responsibility to address these issues. You heard again from Elsa how laws have been put on the books in India, many laws. In the last 2 decades in particular, it has been set in international law, largely extending back to the UN Fourth World Conference on Women, which we will mark 25 years next year, where it was indeed stated that these are issues that violate the rights of women, human rights. Women are human, women's rights are human rights. It is also not a private issue, not a cultural issue, which one often hears, well, this is just the way it is. No, it is a criminal issue that needs to be addressed by governments, which have the responsibility to protect all of their citizens from this violence and to prosecute the perpetrators. Think back to Elsa's presentation and what's missing in the context of India in terms of not acting on these issues and why the data is so compelling about what needs to be done. However, too often, as you've heard, these laws are enacted but not enforced or implemented. Violence against women is especially widespread in fragile and conflict-affected societies, where democratic institutions are not as strong as they need to be in their governance, in rendering justice, in the vitality of those institutions that undergird a democratic society. And so we see state unresponsiveness to the serious societal challenge. And we see it in spades in conflict-affected states like Liberia, Afghanistan, and the DRC. So to see the implications of what she discussed in the magnitude of what it represents. Another consequence is to a country's development, which you heard about, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. The goal that she put up on the screen, goal number 5, is about gender equality and women's empowerment. To realize that goal is to realize all the goals. And that goal has as one of the key indicators violence against women. So this rises to the top of the world debate on development. And this goal is one that is going to be getting a lot of attention in the days and weeks to come, and we'll see to what extent the needle moves forward. Again, we saw from country rankings on various indices the toll that violence against women takes generally. She looked at the index, one of them that was mentioned, which is one that we at Georgetown University have put out, the first ever index on women, peace, and security. And it looks at the condition of women, not just women's inclusion, how they participate in the workplace, in government, etc. But in terms of justice, where is the discrimination, and in terms of security, this kind of violence and the impact that it takes. And as you heard, India is ranked 131 out of 153 countries. Most of those countries that follow India on that ranking are severely conflict affected. So this is a very serious problem for the largest democracy in the world, a serious problem for all countries. And there is a correlation between pervasive violence, tolerating that violence in a society, and the prospect of future instability and potential conflict. Violence against women can indeed lead to worsening conditions, where the rule of law is undermined and where impunity for these crimes become a way of life. And so focusing on that can tell us much more about what can come and why we need to put that focus on these issues. The best predictor of a state's peacefulness is women's security against violence. Again, we're relating all of this to the prospects for a viable democracy. Similarly, conflict-ridden societies have higher numbers of intimate partner violence, domestic violence. And it's not just the horrible violence that takes place in many of these conflicts, where it's increasingly used as a strategic tool of war, but beyond that violence, what is happening on a more pervasive level in those societies. Recent survey of 7 countries by the OSCE, which Xerxes mentioned in introducing me, it is the largest regional security organization in the world, with several unresolved conflicts, including in Ukraine, for example. What that survey found, the most comprehensive survey of its kind, was staggering in terms of the prevalence of violence against women in the region. 70% of the women disclosed that they had experienced some form of violence since the age of 15. So data like this and Elsa's provides the evidence for shaping policies and advocacy for democratic institutions and officials must pay heed to. She mentioned another manifestation of violence, son preference or male preference. And in too many societies, girls are undervalued, not valued at all. They are often neglected from the start of life, if they survive at all. And this has been discussed by the World Bank and so many others as the phenomena of the missing women. Son preference accounts for millions of the missing. Demographics are out of balance. There are more men than women in India, for example, as she pointed out. And this leads to other forms of violence. We now have many indications that because of the scarcity growing of women in societies, the desperation of men is leading to kidnapping women, to child marriage, to men sharing large numbers of women, to going across borders in search of women. So violence is breeding more violence. The government of India passed a law outlawing use of sonograms, for example, for sex detection. But the practice goes on, and it is more prevalent in the more wealthy segments of the society than it is in the poorer segments. The consequences, again, to the democracy are obvious. And Elsa has shown us the importance of data. These crimes are vastly underreported for all the reasons that you've heard. Women feel stigmatized, and they are often, very often, ignored by law enforcement. What she is doing through anonymous reporting, citing locations and frequency, and the broad-based patterns is something that can energize and has energized a civil society in the area where she works. And the participation of all of the citizens of civil society is something so critical to democracies. So affecting the police responses, affecting changes in transport, affecting local leaders' decision-making, all of this, in fact, enhances democratic participation. More women are able to participate in their societies to the extent that this issue of violence is reduced. They are able to participate in politics, in the economy, more fully in civil society, and as a result of that participation, to strengthen their democracies. We desperately need solutions. Thank you for this example of a solution that can be replicated and scaled. And thank you again, Elsa, for all you're doing.
Thank you, Melanne, for situating Elsa's remarks within the broader global context of violence against women. And thank you especially for your leadership on women's issues and your leadership on the NED board. We now have time for questions and discussion, and I thought I would kick things off by asking a question of my own to Elsa, which is to refer back to that one statistic of how your work has been applied. I think you said in one slide 10 countries, and I know that your app has been picked up in particular in Kenya, in Cameroon, in Nepal. And I wonder if you could share more about the work of Safecity beyond India. To what extent is it having a global reach? And if other populations in other countries, municipalities, or stakeholders in other countries want to draw upon Safecity, how can they do so?
Thanks, Xerxes. And thank you, Ambassador Melanne. First of all, I think this topic deserves a person like your presence, to actually emphasize how important it is, So thank you so much for making the time to come. She just got back from Austria last night, and she's here this morning. To your question, sexual violence is a global issue. It's a global pandemic. And when I first started working on it, my focus was only on India, to be honest. And I went for a Vital Voices regional meetup, and there were women from several parts of the world. And when they heard what I was doing, they said, "Oh, can we use your platform?" And I said, "Sure. If it helps you, why not?" So even before I had officially registered my organization, we were international. How have we used it? So my partner in Kenya, she's an awesome grassroots woman from the informal settlement of Kibera. In Kibera, Google Maps don't even work because there are no formal street names. She already had a project called Talking Boxes, where she had placed physical boxes in several schools, and the children would write anonymous notes about what they were experiencing and put them in the boxes, and she would read those notes. What we helped her do was digitize that data and also collect more data. And she used it to, and then we were able to cluster the data based on descriptors, the big mosque, the pink building, etc. Of course, she had to provide the local context, because sitting in Bombay, I have no clue what's going on in Kibera. But anyway, with her local context, contextual knowledge, and our ability to cluster the data, we were able to find what was happening where. So for example, one of the incidents was where girls on their way to school were being groped. And as a result, many of them wanted to drop out of school or had dropped out of school. And when she looked at what was around that area, she noticed that there was a mosque. And she invited the imam of the mosque for a meeting, showed him the data. He started preaching in his sermons. And that had an instant effect with that community. She also used community radio to educate the larger population. So, to me, it's really who do you bring into the room to find the solutions? Because what would have otherwise happened? Those girls would have dropped out of school. If the same situation had happened in Bombay and we were being groped, the instant reaction would be, okay, tomorrow I won't go down that street, I'll take another street, right? We can change our routing. But you can't do that in Kibera, because if you do that, you might be trafficked. So the consequences are different in different locations, and data helps you understand that. In Nepal, for example, our partner wanted to prove that the transportation in Kathmandu at that time was not adequate for women, during their daily routine. So Kathmandu, unlike other capital cities, have only small mini buses. And if it was meant for 25 people, they would shove 50 people in it. So you can imagine the state of the women being groped and touched, on their daily commute. And that's not the way you want to start work every morning, right? And the data did prove that. She was able to convince the transport authorities to issue women-only bus licenses, and she even plied a bus on one of the busiest routes in Kathmandu, which helped the women. Of course, they had this massive earthquake then, and it got destroyed, and the whole focus shifted. But these are some of the examples that my partners have used where data has helped them. In Cameroon, for example, it was one individual who was able through WhatsApp, because in Cameroon, the internet goes on and off all the time. The government shuts down the internet. But through WhatsApp, she was able to collect over 500 stories. And if you read some of those stories, they are terrible. It's really heartbreaking. But she was an individual, and she managed to do that. And I put her in touch with my contacts in Vital Voices, powerful women who are in politics and in other areas who could use that data to make a case for legislation, because we realized in Cameroon they don't have the laws necessary for some of these forms of violence. My current partner in Malaysia is also trying to do the same. And in Nigeria, you heard about Boko Haram, but it's pretty much, I've never been to Nigeria, but from what I gather, it's, the status of women is also pretty low over there. So, but my focus in India is really about scaling it across India, having more institutional partnerships, because I do believe it's an accountability issue. There's so much you can do as a citizen and at the grassroots level, but without, partners in government, police forces, railway authorities, etc., you can't really shift that systems change. And currently we have a massive project with the Mumbai Railways, and just to give you an indication, millions of people use it. And one of the pictures I showed you was of a woman's compartment, right? So our solutions are, okay, segregate coaches. You have a woman's compartment, and to be honest, I wouldn't be able to travel by train if it wasn't for that woman's compartment. But what happens when you exit that compartment? The station is a general station, the exit areas are general, and then other forms of transport are also general. So are you saying that we always have to be segregated in order to be safe? No. So we need to bring that sensibility into these institutional service providers so that they can provide better prevention mechanisms, but also redressal mechanisms.
Thank you, Elsa. Let us now turn to the audience and invite people to pose questions. And if you would like to ask a question, please identify yourself and your affiliation. Yes, the two gentlemen in front.
Thank you, Elsa, for such a wonderful presentation, and it was very revealing. I've just two questions even.
If you could kindly identify yourself.
Oh, sorry, sir. My name is Gaurav, and I teach at the George Washington. I teach social movements, and my research is on India. I just recently moved, so my entire research has been on India, issues of caste and gender and all.
Thank you.
So I was kind of wanted to just make a quick point what Melanne was also mentioning about, that we should make gender violence as a crime, and she in a way, but I kind of want to add and kind of little disagree on that how it's more of a cultural issue, what actually my research also says, as also kind of Elsa was also trying to highlight, that it's kind of because the patriarchy is so rooted. Like I come from a state called Haryana, which is known for it's infamous for its honor killings. So patriarchy is India, yeah, in India, in close to Delhi, and patriarchy is so rooted that that spoiled the whole culture. So when Elsa, you were saying the data you showed about all these images and the clustering of data, it's all about the public spaces. But what about the private spaces, the home? What you call the domestic space, where actually, because when this Nirbhaya case happened in Delhi, I did a little survey, and even in the nearby cities of Delhi, and I figured out actually, even women, the young women, they revealed that it starts with home. But because, as you said, that's a culture of silence and nobody speaks. But actually, they said we were molested by our own brothers, our own cousins, and I'm talking about the states of Haryana. So that's how I'm saying that this how the culture starts from home, and then when you go out in the public spaces, you see the same reflection of it. So this is one point. And then when you say, again, talking in detail about the domestic, can you imagine the life of Mumbai or Delhi without the contribution of a housemaid these days? Every household in Delhi, Mumbai and the bigger cities have a housemaid. But we never talk about their exploitation. And it is rampant, as per my understanding, as per whatever research I have done. So it is rampant, and there is because they are not educated, it means they don't have any voice. And do we have developed any app for them, or do we have educated them? And then the second time, when you are linking it with democracy, now I was just checking while you were talking, only 18.5% people use mobile smartphone in India. So now imagine now now we should question how inclusive is our approach to democracy, and then we are ignoring the entire rural India. And now this 18.25 is the total. Then if you sort it out through how many women are there, then you will find maybe 5-7%. So I think we need to enlarge our approach. And what about rural India? Thank you so much. Sorry, I took longer time.
Let us take a couple of more questions, and then Elsa and Melanne can respond. So the gentleman next to you had his hand up, and Vera, yes.
My name is Ashok, and I'm with Metaculture, and I'll keep it very short. Just to preface, thank you for what you're doing. I mean, I've heard of Safecity, and it's a privilege to meet the person who started it. And I cannot imagine a subject this important. So thank you very much for that. My question, it's a bit of a question and a comment, is I have to say I'm not persuaded that this issue is as linked with the issue of democracy as you have tried to articulate. In fact, I would say, while it's very important in the issue of inclusivity, today, democracy itself is so much at risk. Resilience is the primary issue. I've been working on democracy for a long time now, and one of the things that I'm very worried about is it's not just gender, even race, caste, all these groups that have not historically found complete inclusion run the risk of being completely marginalized if the political system itself breaks down. So I'm making a distinction between the robustness and the resilience of a democracy and inclusivity, not to take anything away from the importance of everything that you've talked about. I would just put it out there that we not conflate these. We treat them as separate vital issues, because after the last election in India, it's very possible this is the last real democratic election that we will have. This is, democracy is at risk throughout the world, throughout the Western world. The primary focus of anybody who's interested in rights and freedoms today should be to somehow prop up the inefficient, corrupt, and semi-dysfunctional democratic systems, because once they go, everything that you're talking about becomes far more difficult. So
Let me
do you have
just
any thoughts on
interrupt
that?
you there. I think you made your point well, so thank you for that. And then Vera had her hand up. If you could kindly introduce yourself, Vera.
Hi, I'm Vera. I'm a Reagan Fassel Fellow, and I'm very happy and proud to be a friend of Elsa. And thank you for this wonderful presentation.
And you're
thank
from
you.
which country, Vera?
I'm from Georgia. I
Thank
will
you.
very proudly state that. And thank you for wonderful comments. And I will add to what we've learned of Elsa, that every time I talk to her, I learn something that is so obvious and simple, but I have never ever thought or mapped it in the map of the relationships that is in our public or society or at home. So thank you for that. And while listening to your presentation, I had a very intriguing or provocative idea. Do you think it will make any difference or will be useful if we include in this reporting those who are violators or men who have violated women? If they can be honest, if they can report anonymously, and if that helps them and helps the issue. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. So, like I said, when I first started on this journey, I wanted to give back to women. And I was thinking, what's my niche? Where should I focus? And there's just so much of work to be done. I'm just one person, I can do only that much, right? And even if you take violence, what I'm working is on public space violence, which is huge. There's so many. Domestic violence is the most common one, but there's human trafficking, there's sex slavery, there's child marriage, and all kinds of things, So I chose to work on public space violence because I felt it's the easiest to address. It's low-hanging fruit, as in the business world we often say. Why? Because often the perpetrator is not known to you. It's really hard when the perpetrator is known to you and you're trying to address that kind of violence, because it requires a very different approach. And it's not about putting men in jail. We won't have enough space for that, honestly. So, but when you're talking about public space violence, many things, I thought of it, and that's my justification to myself. If women are confident accessing a public space, she will take up a career. She will upskill herself. She will get an education. And that leads to financial independence, which really gives you the options in life. And I know because I have lived it. Thankfully, my family has not really, restrained me or restricted me. So I have really learned to thrive in this world. And there are opportunities available, but there are many women and I'm not talking about only the lower income group, across the economic spectrum face this kind of violence and do not have the confidence to really thrive and realize their own potential. So my way of working on it is, if I were to make systems better for them to access these opportunities, they would have access to finances and options, which would give them the confidence to address even the known perpetrator at home. If you don't have access to your money, how are you going to leave that abusive relationship? Where will you take your kids? And you saw the number of courts per million people. A lot of, now the men's rights groups are talking about false cases of domestic violence. But it's not necessarily false cases. It's often a case that it goes through this, lengthy justice loop, which the woman doesn't have the means to cope with. So she withdraws her case. At the end of the day, you want to protect yourself and your children, So I think what I'm trying to do is niche, and it addresses it. I've already explained that just putting technology out there is not going to translate into the stories. We have to invest in these on-ground workshops. And as Safecity, our platform is not only about technology, we accept paper forms. So, we reach all, and you're right about the mobile penetration. A lot of people think that India is a huge mobile consumer, but it's all men. And the women's access to a mobile phone is very limited. Most women don't own a phone. It's her husband's phone or her father's phone. And then I didn't talk about this one particular statistic that women in India do, on an average, daily 5.5 hours of home work, unpaid work, which means that whilst all of us are surfing our phones and playing games and working on social media, a woman in India actually doesn't have time to waste. So she uses her phone as a phone and not necessarily to get access to information and all the other things that we would use our phones for. So keeping that in mind, it is necessary to have all kinds of ways for women to contribute to this and document their stories, which we have made possible. And the labor problem, India has a law that now even guarantees women in the informal sector the right to work in a safe environment. And we have an e-learning module which we are disseminating across. We do a lot of workshops pro bono to help as many women understand their rights, so that if they want to go down a formal redressal complaint mechanism, then they have that option to do so. Yeah.
Yeah, let me just take a couple of comments that were made. It's interesting to me that the first gentleman who looks at the whole sociological aspects basically said, well, this solution isn't inclusive of all of the other ways that there are inhibitions put on society. That is true. This is one solution. And I think that it should not be undermined or contested just because it doesn't solve all of society's problems. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. But I do think that the point you made about culture is critically important and fundamentally important, because this is about norms in society. It is about customary behavior. It is also against the fundamental rights of individuals, in this case women. So it has that aspect to it as well. Just because it's pervasive in a mode of behavior doesn't mean that this is not a critical element of it. So to that end, I was thinking about, as you were speaking, being at a project in Africa that was a democracy project, and it was a USAID-funded project that was teaching the local people about the fundamentals of democracy. And as I watched it, I didn't understand the language. The interpreter was telling me things, but I could see hands up in terms of, voting and, making their points. They were clearly demonstrating their participation. And afterwards, several months later, the instructor told me that a group of women who were participating in this project, along with the men, came to her and said, what do you do with this thing called democracy? You're teaching us the rudiments, but what's it about? What do you do with it? And she said to them, is there anything in your lives that you want to see changed? And they said, every day we are dealing with the horrors of female genital cutting. It guides our lives. Every woman in this society has to go through it. It often results in the death of mothers in terms of maternal deaths. It is absolutely horrible to go through. It is painful and it is degrading. That's what we'd like to see change. And so they began a process in this community. In the meantime, the president of the country had a law passed saying that female genital cutting was a violation of human rights and illegal. Did that change things in those villages? No, but it was important to note that and that threshold and standard. So they started this process. They went first to the imam, and he said, well, there's nothing in our religion that mandates this horrible practice. And then they went to the leaders of the village, all male. And they explained to the men why this was a problem for half of their village, the women in their village. And through months and months of effort, and this has been replicated elsewhere, the villagers came to understand why this norm, this practice, needed to shift to another norm called the health of our women. And over time, the culture changed. And then it was the men who went to other villages and said, we intermarry with those villages, the men in those villages, they should not have this practice either. And village after village began to change this practice to the point where it is almost gone in many parts of this country and beyond. So yes, culture isn't the last word and the first word. It is the reason a lot of this happens, because it is deeply embedded. But it doesn't mean it can't change, and laws are important too. And then I think to the point on democracy. This is not going to solve the problem of India's democracy overall. It is an important element, I believe. There are lots of problems in many democracies, not just in India. But to say that an issue that so undermines the security of half the population does not impact that democracy or that system of government is to ignore what is happening. And I think, moreover, what is a democracy about? It's about all of the people and their role in that. And we are making it impossible. What is happening in India and elsewhere makes it impossible for a great many of the people, portions of half the society, to really adequately participate because they are insecure what they go through, and the government is not responsive to the problem. So there is a very strong connection. Is it the only undermining of democracy today? No, but you cannot ignore this connection.
Thank you, Melanne. So let us take one last round of questions, and then we will wrap up because we are out of time. Joshua, if you could introduce yourself.
Elsa, thank you for the presentation. As always, I'm always
If you
inspired.
could just tell us who you are, please, Joshua.
I'm always inspired by your work. My name is Joshua Olufemi. I'm from Nigeria, media innovation practitioner. I was wondering how much of the stories, that you've captured, on the app, you've kind of given to community radio stations in India, for instance. I believe that the power of community radio for behavior change communication, and also in helping, give voice to issues of victims or actors of certain crimes or development issues, it's important. And I'm wondering if that's something that you've done or if something you're considering, because at that local level, those stories can be, rehearsed and, so it's just a question. Thank you.
Any other questions at this time? Alison?
Hi, Elsa. Is this on? Hi. Thank you for that. I just had one question. So you briefly mentioned...
Alison from the Women's Learning
I'm
Partnership.
sorry. Yes,
That's
I'm
okay.
Alison Horowski from the Women's Learning Partnership. All right, I got excited about my question.
Sorry.
Elsa, I was wondering, you just mentioned a little bit of the training with the partners that you do, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the needs of your partners, and also just the needs of when other people approach you and other organizations approach you, what kinds of capacity building or what kinds of help do they need in order to be able to use the platform that you came up with?
Thank you for those questions. So community radio, it really depends on if that community wants to use radio as a means to talk about it in their community. They did it in Kibera, and I think they did it on college campuses in Delhi. But we don't, as Safecity, we leave it to the community to decide. About the organizations, the partner organizations, several of them are very new and some of them are established. So based on the partner, how quickly they can integrate the platform, the reporting platform, into their current work is what we work with them on. So like with Jane, who already is established as a grassroots leader, she knows how to use the system. And what we only provide her is the data analysis and helping her think through the trends. But say, for example, my partner in Nepal, hers was a very new NGO. She wanted to solve the whole spectrum of women's rights issues, and we helped her narrow it down to the focus on transport and those issues. So helping her make a business plan for that bus, for example, but also how to engage her authorities, the transport authorities, how to even encourage people to share their data. So they stood at every bus stop and talked to women, and got those stories in. And her data set also showed a trend of known perpetrator violence with regards to child sex abuse, which she couldn't address. So we told her, why don't you hand that data to somebody else who does work in that area? So it's really like a customized capacity building exercise, for our partners. And Vera, I'm sorry, I forgot to answer your question on perpetrators. At this point, with Vital Voices, we are working with them on further developing our app. And we have now added a question about who perpetrated the violence. Not naming the person, but, is it somebody known to you, a stranger, an acquaintance, a family member, etc. We want to keep the form as simple as possible because it's intimidating to share your story. But we haven't gone down that path where we are addressing perpetrators. I think that'll come in the future because restorative justice is something that I'm particularly interested in for the future, but not right now. I don't have the bandwidth.
Well, in conclusion, I just want to reflect on a couple of things that Melanne and Elsa have both shared with us. I was really struck, Melanne, by your telling us that, yes, it is true to a large extent that violence is rooted in human culture, in patriarchal culture, and yet that can be transformed and changed one step at a time. And that relates to what, Elsa, you said in your presentation, and I jotted it down, which I will read to you. You had said, young men really want to be agents of change. They just have not been given the platform to do so. So it really is very indicative of how one step at a time, one boy, one man, one girl, one woman at a time, you can effect change. And so I commend you on implementing that change, being an extraordinary agent of change for India and for the world at large. Thank you, and thank you to Melanne. Thank you all for coming.